Chapter 14, Journey's End. Midday summer had come and gone when Gabriel and his companions learned that they were again to move. Their philosophy course was curtailed, and they were to be transferred to another retreat to commence theology. Several pressing reasons prompted this decision at this particular time. Widespread political disturbances had broken out in many parts of Italy. The War of Independence of 1859 had been followed by a wave of violence and revolution. The Risorgimento movement for the political unity of Italy was in full flood. In June, the brave Duchess of Parma had been expelled from her city. A few days later, Bologna, Ravenna, and Perugia in turn revolted against the papal government and declared for the insurgents. No one knew where violence might break out next or what form it would take. To remove the students from the troubled zone of the Pontifical States, they were being transferred to the remote monastery of Isola in the Hitro-Quisdense kingdom of Naples. Once they had received their instructions, it did not take long to pack their meager baggage and say their brief farewells. This time it would be a much longer journey than their previous trip from Marval to Pivatorina a year before. Even though it would be done by easy stages, they expected to be tired and travel-stained before, 6 days later, they would see their new home in the mountains. On Monday, July 4th, 1859, therefore under the guidance of Father Norbert, the little party set out for Raconti, where they had planned to break the journey for a couple of days. The group that set out for Pivatorina numbered 7, the leader, Father Norbert, and 6 students, Frater Vincent, Francis Xavier, Hermegild, Gabriel, Michael, and Charles. One of the servants of the monastery accompanied them, as driver of the heavy, old-fashioned vehicle which was their means of conveyance. The luggage presented no special problem, for they had neither trunks nor suitcases. Each one carried a bundle. It contained a breviary, a few small devotional booklets, a crucifix, a change of underlinen for the journey, the whole being wrapped in the spare habit and secured with knotted cords. As they started, Father Norbert said the traditional prayers to the guardian angels for a safe journey, followed by 3 Hail Marys. After a short interval for silent recollection, Father Norbert smilingly gave them permission to talk, a permission of which they availed themselves to the full. They were all young and eager, and therefore, full of curiosity about the journey and about their ultimate destination, Father Norbert could answer some of their questions. They would stop at various Passionist retreats on the way. They could also depend upon the generosity of friends and benefactors for meals en route. Everything had been well planned in advance. They might be tired, but they would not go hungry. Did they have an opportunity at Raconti to pay a visit to the Holy House of Loreto, which is not far away? It seemed highly unlikely that they did so, for this would have involved an unnecessary detour on a journey which was already of a considerable length. In any event, Gabriel and the other students had already gone more than once from Marval to Loreto. Father Norbert states definitely that, in quotes, as a religious, Gabriel had visited the Holy House on more than one occasion, end quotes. He further observes that on these visits, Gabriel had certain special devotional practices which he confided to a fellow student, but adds with admirable honesty, in quotes, at the moment I can't remember exactly what they were, end quotes. From Raconti, Gabriel found time on Tuesday to send a long letter home, telling of his move to Isola. He knew that his aging father would be lonely and depressed at the thought that his son was now farther away than ever, so he tried to console him. In quotes, on Monday 4th of this month, by God's will, I left with my companions for Isola of Peni, near the Gran Sasso of Italy in the kingdom of Naples. It's a very nice place and enjoys both mountain and sea air. When I get there, with God's help, I'll write and let you know the address for letters. Dear Father, please don't be unhappy, because I'm going a little further away from you. I assure you that I'm further away in body, I'm not further away in heart. I'm certain that the further I'm sent from you, by the will of God and for love of Mary, the more God and His Holy Mother in their goodness will take care of you. They will do infinitely more for you than any son could do for his father, end quotes. Continuing the letter, he gives spiritual advice for the whole family, introducing his remarks by gaily observing, in quotes, I suppose whenever you see my letter you all laugh and say, here comes the sermon, end quotes. About himself, he has only the briefest mention, so brief that it must have been tantalizing for his father, who eagerly treasured every little detail. In quotes, thanks be to God, he wrote, I am very well and exceedingly happy in the state I have embraced. Maybe this September I'll get minor orders, as I didn't get them in May, end quotes. The family discord hinted at in previous letters was evidently still a burning question. Gabriel exhorts his father to keep the boys under strict control and does not mince his words. Apparently, unsure of the family reaction, he prefaces his remarks with a word of apology, saying, in quotes, please forgive me, it's really none of my business to write in this way. The affection I have for the whole family compels me to speak very plainly." Then he continues, "Father dear, you still have 3 boys at home. Please keep them well under control. It's better for them to put up with this for a short time rather than blame you afterwards for the opposite. Be inflexible with regard to social evenings, theaters, meetings, company, etc. If they don't wish to obey you, that is their concern. For that they will have to render a strict account to God. But you, once you have done your best, will be free from blame. See that they don't play games of chance, either at home or outside, especially cards. Forbid them to associate with companions whom your prudent judgment would deem unsuitable. Forbid them to read novels or similar books which could cause them the slightest harm. Make them accompany you wherever you can manage it, and don't allow them to run about the town under false pretenses. Dear father, don't allow the thought of their resentment to deter you from this. It is better to let them grumble about it now, and live for all eternity in unity, joy, and happiness, rather than give way to them and one day find yourself reproached and cursed." End quotes. In an effort to restore peace and harmony to the troubled household, Gabriel offers a further suggestion, a suggestion which he would repeat almost word for word in his subsequent letter from Isola 2 weeks later. Obviously, he had to force himself to write in such a strain, for in repeating his advice, he also repeats his apology, observing that, in quotes, "it is only because I wish well to all that I write in this way, otherwise I wouldn't interfere at all." He wrote, "May I offer a word of advice? I would like you to call in and consult a learned, fervent, and zealous priest, and mind you, one that's not broad-minded, and make known to him all that has happened in the family, past and present. Then, beginning with the servants and going on to all the rest, let everyone make a general confession. Enlightened by God and thus knowing all the circumstances, he'll be able to advise and console you. In this way you will avoid the anguish that the devil, sworn enemy of our salvation, can cause you on your deathbed. Personally, thank God, I think well of everyone. At the same time, to prevent the devil from playing his tricks, I earnestly beg you to perform this act of charity. Please, Father, do this for me, and I'll be forever grateful to you." End quotes. After a full day's rest at Raconti, they resumed their journey early on Wednesday morning. Under the hot July sun that blazed down fiercely from a cloudless blue Italian sky, they traveled all day along the winding, dusty road. At nightfall, they reached the newly opened Passionist monastery of Torre San Patrizio, St. Patrick's Tower. On the following day, the route lay along the coast to their next stopping place, the retreat of the Annunciation at Gallivonia. The monastery was pleasantly situated near the sea, but was surrounded by swamps and marshes, which were infested with frogs. Often, these unwelcome visitors invaded the ground floor of the building, whilst after dark they made night hideous with their dismal croaking. At Gallivonia, Gabriel was pleased to encounter his novitiate companion, Brother Sylvester, now cook in the monastery. Brother Sylvester gratefully remembered the spiritual relief that Gabriel had secured for him, and was anxious to show that he had not forgotten his debt to the Madonna. Seizing an opportunity, he beckoned to Gabriel to follow him, as he had something special to show him. Together, they entered the kitchen, where, beaming with honest pride, the brother pointed to an artistic picture shrine of Our Blessed Lady, promptly displayed high upon the wall. Gabriel was so delighted that he boyishly jumped for joy, trying in vain to reach up to kiss the picture. The group remained at Gallivonia for a couple of days to rest and regain strength for the last stage of the journey. On Sunday morning, they turned their backs to the sea and faced the long, steep road that led inland towards the mountains. After 15 miles, they arrived at Termao, where they were hospitably welcomed by the Capuchin fathers. Here, too, they had a pleasant surprise. A friendly family had heard of their arrival and had placed a large, comfortable carriage at their disposal. In high good humor, they clambered in and quickly covered the next 10 miles to Montorino at Vamano. Here again, the kindly Capuchins warmly received the weary travelers as they awaited the arrival of a guide to lead them to Isola. From Montorino to Isola, there was no proper road, no means of access, save rough mule tracks over precipitous mountain passes. The bleak prospect before the students was to mount mules, urge them forward, and hope for the best. At Spoleto, Gabriel had been fond of open-air pursuits. He was a seasoned huntsman and could travel across country afoot without much difficulty. But this would be a new experience. Gingerly, he eyed the mule as he swung himself into the saddle. They set out early on Sunday afternoon, but dusk was falling before they arrived at Isola. Gabriel was saddle-sore and weary when he slipped stiffly from his mule and made his way to his allotted cell. They had reached journey's end. For Gabriel, in more senses than one, it was indeed journey's end. If he gave it any thought at the time, Isola would figure in his mind as no more than a temporary home, no different from the other retreats in which he had lived. He could quite reasonably presume that after ordination he would go forth from Isola to exercise his chosen apostolate. But for him, there would be no ordination, no going forth ever again. His apostolate was to start at that very spot where his remote tomb was destined to become one of the great pilgrimage centers of Italy, and indeed of the whole world. As Gabriel curiously explored his new surroundings, he had of course no inkling of what the future held in store. His first letter from Isola is cheerful and optimistic, although he again asks his father not to be too exacting with regard to frequent writing. In quotes, "On Sunday evening, thanks be to God, we arrived safely at this retreat. The sight of so many fruit trees confirms what I wrote before, that this is a very good climate. Thank God, I am very happy here. The long journey and the way to address your letters here are the reasons why I didn't write sooner. Father dear, I assure you that I write letters more often than anyone else. Therefore, if you don't see my letters quite so often in the future, please don't take it to heart, as that would be unreasonable. You may be sure that the more I act like all the others, for love of Jesus and Mary, and instead of writing letters, keep strictly to rule, as do all the others, the more Jesus and Mary will take care of you, and everyone else to whom I ought to write." End quotes. Gabriel kept strict to his resolution about curtailing letters from Isola. In quotes, "When he went to Isola," Michael remembered, "he didn't send news so often to the family, saying that, as he had withdrawn from the world, he had little or nothing to do with it." End quotes. In his letters, Gabriel had little to say about the retreat in which he lived. He had wished, or perhaps he had known, he could have written at much greater length about the monastery hidden in the foothills at the base of Gran Sasso. Tradition asserted that the original monastery had been founded by St. Francis of Assisi in 1215. In the course of his travels, the gentle saint came to Isola to restore peace between two feuding families of the nobility. He put an end to the long-standing vendetta and prevented a renewal of the quarrel by skillfully removing the cause. He asked both parties to make him a joint gift in perpetuity of the piece of land which was the origin of the dispute. A small church dedicated to the Annunciation was already built there. St. Francis enlarged the church and dedicated it to the Immaculate Conception. Beside it, he founded a friary, in which the typical Franciscan blessing may still be seen over one of the portals. In quotes, "Peace to those who enter, and a blessing on those who stay." End quotes. In this remote spot, the peaceful life of the Franciscans continued through the changing centuries until the friary was suppressed under the Napoleonic regime in 1806. For almost 40 years, church and monastery remained deserted, crumbling away into ruin and decay. The Bishop of Penne, Monsignor Dominic Riccanini, offered the buildings to the Passionists in 1838, but they had not sufficient numbers available to form a full community. The offer remained in abeyance for 6 years until in 1844 2 Passionists were sent to inspect the property. They found the solitary location well suited to the ideal of St. Paul the Cross, but reported that extensive repairs would be needed to make the buildings livable. The bishop readily agreed to their proposal and assigned the property to the Passionist congregation. But the renovation took longer than anticipated, and the bishop did not live to see the arrival of the Fathers. Some months before his death, in July 1846, he said sadly, in quotes, "It would have made me very happy to see this foundation completed and flourishing in the diocese." End quotes. In the following year, however, the Passionists arrived at Isola, and the regular routine of monastic life was resumed. 12 years had elapsed since then, so the arrival of Gabriel and his companions was a welcome addition to the strength of the little community. When they had settled down, Father Norbert thought the time opportune to send a detailed report to Sante Pacenti. He opened with a rather charming word of apology for his seeming neglect in not doing so before. Evidently, he was well aware of the old man's insatiable desire for news about his Passionist son. In quotes, "Dear Signor Pacenti, it is now 3 years since, by God's will, I first undertook the spiritual direction of your son. It may have been my duty to write at least sometimes to give you a word of comfort about your boy, but up to now I haven't done so. May I hope that the present note will make amends for the past neglect. From the time he entered the Passionists, Frater Gabriel has given himself completely to God. There has never been any reason to correct him for laziness, tepidity, and so forth. On the contrary, I always had to keep a sharp eye on him, because if I hadn't looked after him, he would have gone too far and damaged his health, both of soul and body. Now I am completely reassured on this point, because his docility has removed all doubts from my mind. With regard to his health, he was sick but once. That was just when Pacifica came to see him at Pivertorina and found him convalescent. He had a sore throat or something like that. I'm not quite sure what it was. I'm afraid it came from the climate at Pivertorina. It suits some people, but others find it gives them throat trouble. In fact, I had the same trouble myself, but now we are in a most bracing climate. In the 9 days that we've been here, we find it suits us much better than Pivotrinia. Our heads are clear, and there's no longer any need to be constantly clearing the nose and throat, as was the case in the damp air of Pivotrinia. To speak only of Frater Gabriel, he has greatly improved since he arrived here. He has put on some weight and has a much better color. I hope the improvement will continue. I'm not saying that he was sick before, but simply that the new climate suits him better than the last. Before I finish, may I ask you to tell Gismondi's parents that he is doing very well and seems happy enough. Remember me to Frater Gabriel's brothers and to all the family. May I ask your remembrance in your prayers? Devotedly yours, Norbert of St. Mary. Isola, July 19, 1859. Although not yet alarmed, Father Norbert was clearly concerned about Gabriel's health from the time of their arrival at Isola. In the milder climate, Father Norbert also thought that some open-air activity would prove beneficial and gave Gabriel an opportunity to develop his aptitude for gardening. He had always been fond of flowers and used them, as he used all things, to raise his thoughts to God. In quotes, God in his love created them for us, he said, and they speak to us of his goodness and his beauty. End quotes. He was therefore placed in charge of a section of the monastery garden and set to work with the enthusiasm of a born gardener. Gabriel must have been gifted with green fingers, for soon his little plot became a showpiece of the garden, brilliant with a pleasing variety of multicolored flowers. They were not merely for display. Gabriel had dedicated the results of his work to Mary, for all his flowers were destined for her altar. Soon his plot became known as the Little Garden of the Madonna. This title pleased him very much and inspired him to greater effort to make it worthy of his queen. For him it was a real labor of love, and with his usual thoroughness he aimed at nothing less than gardening perfection. The soil was dug and raked with tender care. Not a weed was allowed to spoil the flower beds. Carefully he nursed the tender seedlings, pruned his rose bushes, plucked away dead leaves. Through the long hot summer he watered his precious plants daily in the cool of the evening, waiting for the blooms to mature. His moment of triumph came when he would gather a huge armful and carry them off to deck the Madonna's altar. Sometimes the simple country folk who came to the church wondered who had arranged the flowers with such delicate artistry. Not until summer had waned and the first frosts of winter had withered his remaining flowers did Gabriel relax his efforts. His garden work had put some color into his pale cheeks and greatly improved him physically, so that during that first year at Isola he enjoyed better health than before. Possibly this improvement awakened his dormant desire for corporal penance, which had been kept in check by Father Norbert's prudent direction. During his novitiate he had asked leave to wear a hair shirt, but this had been denied him. His thirst for austerity continued unabated, and he felt that the time had now come when he might do something to satisfy his desires. A little abashed at his own boldness, he plucked up his courage to approach Father Norbert again. Anticipating his reaction, he asked diffidently if he might perhaps, would it be all right could he have permission for... He tailed off into incoherence. Really, I didn't know what he wanted, said Father Norbert rather testily, so I had to ask him to come to the point and state it plainly. Finally he came out with it. Could he wear a cantilla? A little belt with spiked iron points clasped around the waist? Father Norbert exploded. What? You want a cantilla? It's a chain on your will you want. Well, maybe that would be a help too, Gabriel murmured with a deprecating smile. Be off with you about your business, said Father Norbert tartly, and let me hear no more about this cartilla. But, as Michael had pointed out when his vocation was being discussed, Gabriel was not one to give up easily. For all his good resolutions, his native stubbornness and strong will were not yet under complete control. So when he renewed his same request a little later, Father Norbert decided that he needed a sharp lesson in humility and obedience. Very well, he replied briskly. Wear the cantilla, by all means. Wear it all day long, but wear it outside your habit and publicly, so that all may see what a holy man you are, what a great one for penance. End quotes. This was much more than Gabriel had bargained for. Although terribly humiliating by his ordeal, he accepted it with a good grace, well aware that he had brought it upon himself by his persistence. All a day he appeared with a spitted belt fastened around his waist. Evidently he had ready for himself. At class, in choir, in the refectory, at recreation, Gabriel wore his belt of penance, and offered no word of explanation. His companions, of course, passed no comment, but their amused glances and suppressed smiles showed that his predicament had not escaped their notice. Not until the day was over did Father Norbert relent and tell him to lay it aside, but from then onward the matter was not mentioned again. Gabriel had profited by this lesson, even though it was learned the hard way. There is a note in his spiritual journal which perhaps may refer to this or to some similar experience. In quotes, "The secret of success lies in the conviction that we are but dust, God alone can raise us from the dust and sustain our efforts. To acknowledge oneself to be a fool is to become wise with the wisdom of God and to be raised to a throne of spiritual power." End quotes. When winter prevented work in the garden, Gabriel found another outlet for his talents. Rummaging in an old attic, he found a discarded statue of Our Lady of Sorrows, which perhaps reminded him of the one he had cherished at home. It was a poor thing, chipped, discolored, covered with dust, but he thought he could see possibilities in it. Rescuing it from the lumber room, he brought it to his cell and asked Father Norbert's permission to restore it in his spare time. When the priest assented, Gabriel procured brushes and paints and set to work with a will. He carefully washed and cleaned the figure, mended and replaced the broken parts, and with the delicate skill of the artist, touched up the statue until it was as good as new. Although Gabriel apparently continued to write home at regular intervals, the mail service was unreliable and the letters failed to reach their destination. From subsequent correspondence, it is clear, during the period of June to December 1859, 4 or 5 letters which Gabriel sent to his father never arrived at Spoleto. If almost 6 months had elapsed since any news had arrived from Isola, Sante Pacente may well be pardoned for his increasing anxiety. Writing on the last day of the year, December 31st, 1859, Gabriel again points out that he cannot write more often, but adds reassuring details, all the more welcome on account of the disturbed state of the country. In quotes, "I'm answering your letter at once in order to comply with your request, but once again I repeat that it is not our custom to write so often. Even though you write, you mustn't take it amiss in future if I don't reply at once. The climate of this place, as I've already told you, is excellent. Thanks be to God. The little headaches that used to trouble me at Pifertornia don't seem to bother me so much here. So that's a good reason for hoping that they've now disappeared for good. The place where I am now is one of the safest, if not the very safest at the present time. It's far away from any town and well out of the way. There is plenty of food here and the people are most attached to us. It's called Isola because it's a kind of island between 2 streams that rise in the Gran Sasso range." End quotes. Behind the sheltering walls of his monastery, remote from the political storms that were darkening the Italian scene, Gabriel continued his tranquil life of prayer and penance, meditation and study. To his great joy, he was appointed sacristan, and as might be expected, discharged his duties with scrupulous care. Corporals and altar linen were spotlessly clean as befitted the dignity of the holy sacrifice. The hosts to be used at Mass were subjected to individual scrutiny beforehand, and if Gabriel discerned the slightest defect, he ruthlessly rejected them. Father Norbert found him too exacting in his requirements and checked him for being overzealous. Much as he loved his work in the sacristy, Gabriel never presumed to prolong the time allotted for his task. If he happened to be busy and the sound of the bell called him elsewhere, he left the sacristy immediately without waiting to finish what he had begun. He was known to leave a vestment half put away, a missal open at the page where he was arranging the markers, and would return only when he had obtained the requisite permission. When it was Gabriel's turn to ring the bells for the common observance, all knew that for the whole week every bell would be punctual to the second. As the time approached, he would be seen standing ready, bell rope in hand, and the sound of the bell coincided with the striking of the clock. Not all the students were so dependable, so when any extra care was needed, the rector relied upon Gabriel. In Isola during the summer heat, the community went to the lower choir for prayer, either because the clock could not be heard striking the hour at such a distance, or for some other reason, there was confusion in ringing the bell for the end of meditation. Finally, the rector ordered the duty to be permanently entrusted to Father Gabriel, and after that there was no further difficulty. Gabriel had a deep love for the Mass, and was eager to hear and to serve as many Masses as he could. Every morning he formed the intention of assisting in spirit at all the Masses being said that day all over the world. On the rare occasions when matins were dispensed, Gabriel rose early next morning to serve some of the Masses said before morning choir. Those who observed him assisting at Mass were spellbound by the spectacle he unwittingly presented. At the moment of the consecration, his whole appearance seemed transformed. His gaze was so fixed and unwavering that one would almost believe he could see his Lord behind the sacramental veil. His pale cheeks became flushed, his dark eyes glowed, his lips parted in a heavenly smile. His face became so ecstatic that he no longer seemed of this world. When he went forward to Holy Communion, he approached the altar in profound recollection, with joined hands and deeply bowed head. At his thanksgiving, he was so absorbed in God, so completely lost in his immediate surroundings, that he had to be called by name or shaken by the arm to bring him back to earth. The same thing happened repeatedly when he paid a visit to the Blessed Sacrament. In quotes, "He became so lost in prayer," said a companion, "that I had to shake him to bring him to himself." End quotes. His genuflection was slow, deep, and reverent, a real act of faith and love. In quotes, "I often saw him when he thought no one was looking at him," Father Norbert confided, and he always paused a little as he genuflected. It was clear that he was pouring out his whole soul to Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. End quotes. Passing along a corridor, when he again thought he was unobserved, Gabriel was seen to genuflect towards the distant tabernacle. His thoughts centered on the mystery of the real presence, and in his secret heart he walked with God. The swift maturity of his spirit, the growing detachment from the world, are clearly apparent in the letters of this period. In February 1860, he wrote thus to his father, in quotes, "Dearest Father, do you wish to live undisturbed in the midst of such troubles? Do you wish to spend your days in true peace? You still have the church and your home. I speak to you now from my heart. God has removed you from every hindrance. You no longer have any weighty business to attend to, no public position, no longer a large family. All that's left now is the business of your soul and the souls of my brothers. Dear Father, devote all your care to this. Take this alone to heart. Pay no attention to the news of the world, but only to your soul. Spend all your time looking after your soul." End quotes. It must have been frustrating for Sante Pacienti, who above all wanted to have news of his son's health, to find the whole letter devoted to lofty spiritual topics with never a word about his physical condition. Father Norbert, reading over the letter before posting it, did his best to supply the omission by adding some more prosaic details by way of postscript. In quotes, "Father Gabriel is very well. Recently he had to take some medication for indigestion. He is happy and cheerful, but he never ceases to regret his past blindness in taking part in, as he says, amusements, which did not relax his mind, but oppressed him with trouble and remorse. These protestations of his are not just empty words, they are accompanied by deeds performed with such fervor that he has to be restrained. If he remains faithful to the graces which the Lord continues to bestow on him, if he perseveres in his fervor, he will truly become a saint. Let this be your consolation, as it is also mine." End quotes. As Sante Pacienti read the closing lines, his heart felt more at ease. It was kind of Father Norbert to write such consoling words. But was it likely that his son would really become a saint? He was a good boy, yes, but a saint? A saint in the Pacienti family? He wondered.